Hey everyone, welcome back to Installation 00, and today is another video on 10 facts you might or might not have known about things in Halo. In the previous video we did 10 facts you might or might not have known about Mjolnir powered assault armor, and today we continue in a slightly different vein and look at the Spartan-IIIs. I asked in the previous video what subject you wanted me to cover next, and Spartan-IIIs was one that really stood out to me, so that's the subject of today's video. Be sure to let me know in the comments at the end of the video what you want me to cover next, and let me know how many of them you already knew, or the ones that you didn't. In any case, if you are well versed in the lore, this will come as a little refresher on the deep lore of the Halo universe, but if you don't know a lot about Halo lore, this will be quite eye-opening. So let's get right on and discuss 10 facts you might or might not have known about the Spartan-IIIs. Let's roll the intro. Spartan-IIIs are pretty much as big and as powerful as Spartan-IIs. For some reason there seems to be this strange common misconception across large swathes of the Halo community that Spartan-IIIs are smaller and a lot less powerful than Spartan-IIs, and really, on average, that's just not the case. But in order to make heads or tails of this, we need to actually look at the augmentation procedures of the respective classes of Spartans. Now, the Spartan-IIs received extraordinarily brutal surgical augmentations. Now, one of them in particular, the carbide ceramic ossification, could not be performed on a skeleton that was still growing. So the Spartan-IIs had to receive a thyroid implant, which meant that they would grow immensely during their puberty, which itself was early onset. Ultimately meaning that most Spartan-IIs grew to be well over 2 meters in height, most of them sitting in the high 6 foot, low 7 foot. Then and only then were they given the carbide ceramic ossification augmentation set, because if they did grow after their bones had been encased in a ceramic material, their bones would be pulverized to the point that they'd just fall to bits. The muscle augmentation allowed them to lift 3 times their body weight at the age of 14, and at the age of 14 they were twice the weight of a fully grown normal human being, effectively giving them 6 times the strength of the average human being you'd find on the street. The superfibrification of neural dendrites gave them a 300% boost in reflexes, and their occipital capillary reversal surgery allowed them to see in near perpetual darkness. The Spartan-II augmentations were extraordinarily brutal and only had a 54% success rate. The Spartan-IIIs were given a chemical cocktail of augmentations which gave the same net effect as the Spartan-II's surgical augmentations, but with a 100% success rate. As I've covered in my most detailed breakdown into the Spartan-III augmentations, these chemical augmentations for the Spartan-IIIs mean that certain parameters, such as encasing the bones in a ceramic, are non-existent. The bones themselves are chemically reinforced as opposed to surgically encased in a ceramic material. This process in the Spartan-III's bodies would only happen as fast as the process of osteogenesis takes place. This means that many of the Spartan-IIIs who were augmented were still able to grow without their bones being entirely pulverized. Some of the earliest instances that we actually see Spartan-IIIs in combat show the Spartans of Alpha Company at the age of only 12 years old, going up against Covenant forces and killing them in droves. The sole survivors of this particular battle, Tom and Lucy, were only 12 years old. Lucy is still a very small Spartan as Spartans go, and in theory, Spartan-IIIs can continue to grow in height and size after their augmentations, whereas the Spartan-IIs really can't. So that might explain where this misconception has come from for Spartan-IIIs being smaller than Spartan-IIs on average, when that isn't actually the case. But certain specific individuals of Spartan-IIIs are markedly smaller than the average Spartan-II. But again, that may have changed as the years advanced and they grew. As far as not being as powerful as Spartan-IIs, again, these chemical augmentations boosted the same parameters that the Spartan-IIs had boosted by their augmentation sets by basically the same margins. The muscular enhancement protein injections increased the strength to approximately being able to lift 3 times their body weight. The neural catalyst injection increased their reaction time by 300%. The bone reinforcement catalyst made their bones nearly unbreakable once the process of osteogenesis had taken place. And the Spartan-IIIs could see in near perpetual darkness. So really, in spite of wider opinion, it boils down to this: Spartan-IIIs are not smaller than Spartan-IIs. Spartan-IIIs are not weaker than Spartan-IIs. In fact, truth be told, Spartan-IIIs and Spartan-IIs are pretty much neck and neck. The only thing the Spartan-IIs have going for them is that they have very, very specific genetic markers that allow them to bond to the augmentations more successfully and more comprehensively than other human beings. The Spartan-IIs were already the creme de la creme of humanity before they got given the Spartan augmentations, so ultimately, on the whole, they are basically the same. The Spartan-IIIs were not created by Dr. Catherine Halsey. This is, I think, relatively common knowledge. The Spartan-IIs were created directly by Dr. Catherine Halsey with the Office of Naval Intelligence Section 3. The Spartan-IIIs were not. The Spartan-IIIs were a covert project designed to make Spartan soldiers much cheaper and used for high-profile suicide-like missions, and was actually created by one of Dr. Halsey's most pronounced opponents, Colonel James Ackerson, formerly of the UNSC Army, but since assigned to a liaison position with the Office of Naval Intelligence, then becoming the mastermind behind the Spartan-III program and ultimately finding himself a seat at the UNSC Security Council. He had many different projects going on within the UNSC High Command at any given time, and since a lot of his projects were in competition with Dr. Halsey's projects for funding, he had a long-standing rivalry with both Dr. Catherine Halsey and the Spartan-II program itself. He went to great lengths to crack into and research Dr. Halsey's work in order to reverse engineer it and make it cheaper for the sakes of the Spartan-III program. Ultimately, the best decision he made was acquiring Spartan-051 Kurt to train all Spartan-III operatives. And this is why the Spartan-IIIs are so damned effective, because they were taught by both an actual Spartan-II and the very man who trained the Spartan-IIs in the first place, Senior Chief Franklin Mendez. Ultimately, post-war, it just didn't matter whom these original projects were conceived or trained or developed by. They were ultimately all folded into the Spartan Operations, a singular umbrella branch that covers all respective Spartan classes. Spartan-IIIs were meant for suicide missions. This is probably the worst kept secret of the Spartan-IIIs. The whole idea behind the Spartan-III program was to make super soldiers cheaper and exchange soldiers for time in regards to the war against the Covenant. 300 Spartan-IIIs at a time were trained and then graduated and ultimately dispatched into the theatre of war to take down high-profile targets. While each Spartan company would graduate and see numerous fights and engagements in the early days, weeks and months of their service careers, they were all predestined to go on a high-profile mission designed to stall or slow down or cease the advance of the Covenant machine. And barring a few selected individuals who were removed just before that final mission so they could receive special training and go on to fight countless wars thereon, all members of each Spartan company would ultimately meet their deaths in that final mission. Alpha Company saw numerous combat deployments until Operation Prometheus, a mission to a Covenant-controlled asteroid where a shipbuilding complex had been established and materials were being harvested from the asteroid to be turned into construction materials for the Covenant warships. Alpha Company were tasked with taking down the reactors, causing the liquid materials that were being siphoned to harden inside of the reactors, clogging them indefinitely and ceasing production. The mission was a success, but every single member of Alpha Company died. Beta Company graduated and went through an unspecified quantity of engagements before Operation Torpedo, where the Spartans were tasked with shutting down Covenant fuel refineries where materials were being refined for the deuterium-tritium fuel that's used inside their warships. Again, the mission was a success. The refineries were shut down, but every member of Beta Company died, with the exception of Tom and Lucy, whom ultimately went on to train Gamma Company. Members of various classes were shipped out before their suicide mission for other operations. These Spartans were identified as being particularly talented in certain fields and then selected for special training in specialist units. Alpha Company, for example, ultimately went on to do Operation Prometheus. However, just beforehand, several Spartans were pulled out, including Emil, Carter, June, Tom, Kevin, and Rosenda. In Beta Company, on top of Lucy and Tom, Spartan B170, Spartan B312, Cat B320, Jonah B283, and Roland B210 were all withdrawn from Beta Company before their mission and folded into other specialist non-company teams. In the case of Jonah and Roland, they were factored into the Headhunters. Probably the most well-known individuals were those of Noble Team, consisting of Emil, Carter, June, Tom, Rosenda, Kat, Spartan 312 and the Spartan-II, George 052. The Spartans of Gamma Company received illegal augmentations. On top of the 4 basic chemical augmentations that all Spartan-IIIs received, the Gamma Companies received 3 additional augmentations. One known as the Neural-Altering Non-Carcinogenic Mutagen 009762-00, which altered key regions in the individual's frontal lobe to enhance the aggressive response, making the animal part of the brain much more accessible to the individual in times of stress. This ultimately allowed the individual to access enormous reserves of hysterical strength and endurance, and enabled them to remain fighting even when experiencing systemic shock which would be fatal to any normal human being. This allowed the Spartan-IIIs of Gamma Company to perform physical feats when basically their lives were on the line that were worlds apart from any other Spartan class that's ever been seen. This augmentation was not without its side effects, however. The individual also had to receive 009127-PX, otherwise known as cyclodexione-4, bipolar integration drug, which counteracted the negative effects of the earlier mentioned augmentation, being the depression of higher reason centers of the brain over time, which ultimately leads to bouts of uncontrolled aggression, which doesn't differentiate friend from foe. And they were given a third drug, 009927-DG, misoalanzapine, which counters the psychological effects of the bipolar integration drug, as that one could cause psychotic episodes. So in spite the immense endurance that we've witnessed the Spartan-IIIs of, say, Noble Team exhibit when they're seriously injured, this is still relatively in keeping with Spartan normal standards. The Spartan-IIIs of Gamma Company, as previously mentioned, could remain operational even when grievously injured. For example, Dante G188 was able to function and fight for some time after a number of needle rounds had blown his chest wide open. And to make matters worse, even after this had happened, he wasn't even aware of his injuries. And in a similar instance, Olivia G291 engaged and destroyed an aggressor sentinel with her bare hands, ultimately managing to pin it to the ground and smash it repeatedly with a rock the size of her torso. And she did all this while both of her femurs were broken. As an individual who's broken their pelvis, femur, and a plethora of other bones in a single incident, I can personally vouch that once you go into shock, a lot of the pain that you'd expect to feel in these kinds of instances disappears as you enter into shock. So it's not unlike this, just dialed up to 11. Spartan-IIIs were younger than Spartan-IIs when they were conscripted. Now everyone knows that the Spartan-IIs were conscripted at the age of 6 when they were abducted from their parents and replaced with flash clones that would ultimately die of quote-unquote natural causes thereafter to give the parents closure and not raise any eyebrows as to where these children were disappearing to. Spartan-IIIs were not acquired like this. The Spartan-IIIs were actually orphans of the war. Their parents had been killed by the Covenant, so if nothing else they had a palpable reason to hate the Covenant to their core. But due to the increased success rate of the augmentations and the relaxation of the very strict genetic markers required to undergo augmentation, children were selected from a much larger pool, some of the youngest of which were only 4 years old when they began their training. Fast forward the clock a bit, if only those proud Sangheili warriors knew they were getting stomped into the ground by 12-year-old children. Gamma Company were not the end of the Spartan-IIIs. Although their home planet, where they were being trained, of Onyx, was ultimately attacked and then broke apart and was revealed to be a shield world actually made of Onyx Sentinels, Gamma Company, who had only recently graduated, were not the last class that were planned to go through Onyx. In fact, Delta Company had already been proposed and the camp was being prepared for their arrival when the Onyx conflict began. That means there was ultimately a shipment of 300 plus between 4 and 7 year olds destined for the Spartan-III program that had to be redirected away from Onyx while they were en route. And while at face value you'd then expect that since the facilities that would have been used to train them were destroyed, that pretty much means the end of the Spartan-III program. It's such a huge investment for the UNSC, the Office of Naval Intelligence, and ultimately the UEG, that the idea that they were disbanded probably doesn't necessarily stack up to much. In fact, I personally think that they were likely redirected to a different facility where they probably went through training and may have even recently been augmented, meaning that there is yet another batch of Spartan-IIIs about to make their way onto the battlefield. Headhunters are specially trained Spartan-IIIs and a secret even to their peers. Now there are an unknown quantity of Spartan-IIIs who became Headhunters. These Spartan-III operatives would only be evaluated for induction into the Headhunters after they'd completed and survived 2 or more specially assigned training missions. Once selected, they were separated from the rest of their Spartan company and moved to a completely different training facility on the opposite side of the planet. Detailed performance and psychoanalytical evaluations were performed alongside intense interview processes and extremely advanced training were meant to give a detailed image about which Spartan-III candidates would work best with one another. Based on all of this extraneous information, Spartan teams were then assigned into 2-man teams. But the training and assessment wouldn't end there. For the next 2 years, these 2-man Headhunter teams would go through supervised field exercises for 7 months, followed by 6 months of actual combat deployment, with other soldiers rotating in to fill gaps when either one or both members of that Headhunter binary would be killed in action. And it was overwhelmingly likely that they would be killed in action. Even now, well after the Human Covenant War, these particular Headhunter programs are still in operation underneath the Spartan Operations Branch. How they're structured, who's involved, and how many is entirely unknown. There are Spartan-IIIs in the ranks of the Banished. The Spartan-III team Ferret, made up of Lieutenant Vita Lopez, an ONI agent, Mark G313, Olivia G291, and Ash G099, managed to infiltrate their way into the Keepers of the One Freedom, whom at the time were a target of the Office of Naval Intelligence. While posing as acolytes of the Keepers of the One Freedom, The Ferrets managed to gather a huge amount of intelligence for the Office of Naval Intelligence, which thereby allowed them to launch a massive eradication campaign against the Keepers of the One Freedom. The leader of the Keepers, Castor, then responded by taking refuge with the Banished. When this opportunity presented itself, Oni insisted that the Ferrets extended their undercover mission to basically set up the opportunity and groundwork for an assassination attempt on Atriox. Before they had the opportunity, Atriox actually left the galaxy on his CS-class assault carrier, the Enduring Conviction, and ultimately arrived at the Ark. This snowballed into basically all support from the Office of Naval Intelligence for Ferret team to be completely and utterly destroyed. Their communications for delivering intel, the emergency extraction they had on standby, the Prowler support, as well as the smoothers that the Gammas would need to continue to be operationally effective, were all cut off. They would disappear for a time but re-emerge on Reach, where they were helping the Keepers and the Banished find the Ark portal hidden beneath the surface of Reach. Lopis managed to deliver an important message to Fred 104 before disappearing once again. They would ultimately stop the Keepers of the One Freedom from activating the Halo array from the Ark Citadel, and would shortly thereafter join up with the UNSC Spirit of Fire. One can only imagine what sort of deeds this human squad within the Banished had to perform in order to earn their rite of passage or keep up appearances during their time with the Keepers of the One Freedom and the Banished. Ultimately, if there was an opportunity that presented itself and there were humans that needed to be killed, and the Ferrets just so happened to be there, they couldn't obviously stop themselves from killing the humans, as that could potentially give away the fact that they are double agents. So again, one can only assume what they had to do to barter and buy their trust into the Keepers of the One Freedom and the Banished. The Gammas need antipsychotic drugs. As previously mentioned, one of the augmentations that the Spartan-IIIs of Gamma Company received was illegal, but allowed them an enhanced endurance, strength, and aggression response, particularly when their bodies were under stress or injury. In order to counteract the negative effects of these drugs, the Spartan-IIIs of Gamma Company have to periodically be given what's colloquially known as smoothers, a cocktail of antipsychotic and bipolar integration drugs that keep the Spartan-IIIs operationally effective. They have to be administered approximately every 12 hours intravenously, although there are longer lasting subcutaneous implants that can be given. But ultimately, if they are denied these drugs, the Spartans of Gamma Company rapidly lose their rationality and will quickly slip into a psychotic state. Early onset symptoms of the smoothers' effects wearing off include nervousness and general irritability, followed by paranoia and fits of temper and physical outbursts. It gets progressively worse thereafter. In one particular case involving Mark G313, after over a day without his smoothers, he began having difficulties distinguishing friend from foe in the middle of a firefight. He actually held a Marine sergeant hostage with a combat knife to his throat before being convinced by Fred 104 that he was an ally rather than an enemy. Left long enough, any Spartan-III of Gamma Company without their smoothers could and likely would indiscriminately attack friend or foe without a second thought. And there is seemingly no end to this loop. One would assume the final net result of continual denial of the smoothers is complete deterioration into full psychosis and likely death thereafter, either by their own recklessness or by their own impulses of aggression and physical conflict, basically getting in the way of their basic functions such as eating, drinking, and sleeping. And so there we have it, 10 things you might or might not have known about the Spartan-IIIs. So how many did you already know? Did you know most of them? Did you know all of them? Or only a couple? Let me know in the comments down below, alongside what you want me to cover in the next 10 things you might not have known. I'll be keeping an eye on the most popularly asked for the next video, and until then, Thanks for watching. If I could respectfully ask, if you enjoyed this video, consider hitting the subscribe button and the little bell icon so you're told the second a new video hits the shelves. Hit this video with a like if you enjoyed, and if not, it's not a problem. And be sure to pop a comment below to throw me an idea on what you want to see next. Massive thanks to my awesome patrons, Spartan-10148, the Metarch of my facility, Falcon, Prophet, Leon, Sylphia, Mikhail and Irrefutable, the monitors of the array, Darian, Flaming Halo, Cameron, Spartan-0137, the Cave Potato, Andrew, Shia, Dakota and Ghost, my diligent sub-monitors, my fleet of Strato Sentinels, and my loyal enforcers, and all other patrons who have supported the channel and helped keep the domain operational. Huge props and recognition to Todd Morrison, Spartan-137, Wesley Stuckey and Jacob Kemp for jumping on as Tier 0 Transcendent YouTube members. You guys are epic. Shout out to John for reasons. And if you want to help support the channel and score yourself tons of perks and merch, head over to Patreon or consider becoming a YouTube member. Links, as ever, are in the description. Much love, take it easy everyone, and find peace in the domain.